The hall buzzed with quiet excitement and nervous energy. Parents, friends, and music lovers filled the seats, chatting in low voices while glancing at the stage. The lights were bright but not blinding, casting a warm glow over the polished wooden floor and the grand piano waiting at the center. Behind the stage, performers of all ages adjusted their clothes, warmed up their hands, and whispered words of encouragement to one another. Some paced nervously, others closed their eyes, taking deep breaths to steady their hearts. In the corner, a small child waited quietly, barely noticeable among the taller, older competitors. At just 6 years old, the child seemed too small for such a big moment. The dress was simple and neat, the hair tied back carefully, and the shoes polished but scuffed from constant practice. The little hands fiddled with the edges of the music sheet. Though no one really expected a child so young to make much impact in this semifinal, most of the adults glanced at the child with polite curiosity rather than expectation. Some smiled softly, thinking it would be a cute short performance. Others barely looked, focused on older contestants who had been practicing for years. Even the judges, stern and professional, shared small nods to each other, as if to say, well, we'll see. The room carried a mix of hope, nerves, and casual doubt. This was the kind of moment where talent often shone, but many assumed the small child would be overshadowed by bigger, more experienced performers. Yet, there was a quiet determination in those tiny eyes. The child didn't fidget, didn't cry, didn't show fear. Instead, there was a calm readiness, a kind of stillness that seemed almost impossible for someone so young. Backstage, a parent knelt down and whispered a few last words of encouragement. Remember what you practiced. Just enjoy it. That's all that matters. The child nodded silently and tucked the sheet of music into the piano bench. Other parents whispered and fussed, double-checking hair, adjusting collars, or offering reassuring pats on the back. The small child hardly needed any of that. Years of practice had turned nervous anticipation into quiet confidence. Every key on the piano had been touched hundreds, maybe thousands of times. Every phrase of the music was memorized, every note known like a story that lived in the child's fingers. Still, the child's mind was calm, focused not on winning or impressing, but simply on sharing the music. Around the hall, older performers tried to focus, but many couldn't help stealing glances at the little competitor. Some frowned, perhaps feeling a subtle sense of threat or disbelief. How could someone so young even hope to compete with years of experience? Others chuckled quietly, thinking it would be charming, a brief distraction from the serious performances that followed. No one realized that charm alone would not be what this child had to offer. There was something more, something quiet and deep, something that couldn't be measured by age or size. But nobody backstage or in the audience could guess it yet. The lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the next round. Performers began moving toward the stage one by one. Some carried confidence like a cloak around their shoulders, walking tall and commanding attention. Others, like the small child, moved with a careful, deliberate grace. Even in the shadows of the wings, the child seemed larger than life in the way attention quietly gathered without effort. A deep breath, a step forward, and suddenly the child was at the piano. The polished surface reflected the lights, the keys waiting patiently. The room fell quieter, the murmurs fading as if the music itself was demanding attention before it even began. The judges adjusted their papers, cleared their throats, and glanced up with mild curiosity. Cameras focused on the stage, capturing every movement. The child's hands rested lightly on the keys, poised but relaxed. The audience leaned forward instinctively. There was an almost magnetic pull, not from showmanship or theatrics, but from the tiny figure at the piano, radiating a mix of calm confidence and quiet intensity. No one spoke. The first note was about to arrive. A simple sound, really, but it carried the weight of practice, passion, and a story waiting to unfold. As the child's fingers touched the first key, a hush spread across the hall. It was almost imperceptible at first, a subtle shift in the energy of the room. The melody of Amélie Poulain began softly, tenderly. Every note was careful yet natural, flowing like a stream of emotion that filled the space. People in the audience glanced at one another, surprised at the depth and clarity coming from such small hands. The music was precise but warm, professional yet playful, emotional yet restrained. It was as if the child had carried the story of the music inside for years, ready to release it all at once. Backstage, the parent watched with a mixture of pride and awe. Other performers stopped mid-warm-up to listen. Even the seasoned musicians leaned forward in their chairs, unable to hide the intrigue forming on their faces. The hall was no longer just a stage. It had transformed into a place where every person listening felt the music speak directly to them. The small child, unaware of all the attention, simply played. Fingers moved quickly when needed, gently when required, expressing each note as if telling a secret story. The performance was already different from anything anyone had imagined. Even before it reached the middle of the piece, the child's eyes were focused on the keys. But occasionally, they lifted to glance at the audience, as if noticing the people listening and letting the music reach them without a single word. It was rare to see someone so young perform with such awareness, balancing technical skill with heartfelt expression. Every nuance of the melody was captured, every pause and every swell in the music carefully molded. It was the kind of playing that could make adults forget their expectations, that could silence chatter and make people sit still and wonder. Parents of other competitors exchanged nervous looks. Could someone this small really challenge years of experience and training? The answer was becoming more and more apparent with each note. Time seemed to stretch in the hall. The first minute of the performance felt like a lifetime, every second filled with wonder. People who had come to see just another competition began to realize they were witnessing something rare. The child's presence at the piano was commanding without demanding. It wasn't about being loud or flashy. It was about making every sound matter, giving weight to a melody that many adults struggled to express with such clarity. Audience members leaned forward in their seats. Some whispered to each other, trying not to disturb the performance, while others sat completely still, unable to speak at all. The music seemed to touch something deep, something instinctual that didn't care about age or size. It only cared about the story being told through the piano. The child's small shoulders moved slightly with the rhythm, following the natural rise and fall of the melody. The notes danced lightly at times, then grew stronger and more deliberate when needed. Even the judges, who had heard countless performances, exchanged glances that carried unspoken surprise. One leaned back slightly, eyebrows raised, while another tapped a pencil against the table, almost unconsciously, caught up in the unexpected depth of the playing. It was clear that this performance was not simply competent. It was extraordinary. The child was not only playing the notes, but also shaping them into a narrative that everyone could understand. Whether they knew the music or not, backstage, some of the older performers fidgeted with anxiety. The little competitor had become the standard against which everyone else would now be measured. The energy that had been nervous and casual just moments ago was replaced with awe and a little fear. If this child could perform like this, what hope did they have to stand out? Even for the audience, who had come expecting to see a few enjoyable performances, the shift was profound. Something small, delicate, unassuming, had captured the room in a way that was impossible to ignore. As the first part of the melody ended, the child's hands hovered briefly over the keys before diving into the next section. The music seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the chest of someone fully alive with emotion. Each note carried intention. There were no wasted motions, no hurried fingers. The audience felt as though they were part of the music, walking alongside the story the child was telling. It was more than skill. It was presence. People didn't just hear the performance, they felt it. Hearts seemed to synchronize with the rhythm, eyes followed every hand movement, and a quiet understanding spread throughout the room. This was more than a competition. This was a small human connecting deeply with everyone in the hall through the language of music. The child's face remained calm, serene, even. There was no sign of nervousness, no hesitation, only focus, only joy. The tiny figure at the piano seemed unaware of the stir being caused by something so simple yet profound: the courage to perform honestly, to play with heart, to make music matter. It was a rare gift, especially at such a young age. As the notes continued, the audience collectively leaned in, holding their breath, waiting to see where this journey would lead. Even before the performance had fully unfolded, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. What had started as a small, quiet presence backstage had transformed the hall into a space of wonder, of anticipation, of awe. The child played as if telling a story from memory, each note, a word, each phrase, a sentence, every pause, a moment to breathe and let the listener imagine. People in the audience who had never played an instrument could understand the feeling. Some smiled softly, remembering moments from their own childhood. Some closed their eyes, letting the music take them elsewhere. Others sat upright, amazed at the control, the precision, the emotion being expressed by someone so young. The child's talent was no longer a quiet curiosity. It had become the heartbeat of the room. Every eye followed, every ear listened, every heart responded, as the first part of the performance drew to a gentle close. The audience felt a quiet thrill, a subtle shiver, a sense that something rare had just begun. The small child at the piano had quietly stolen attention without even trying. The room, full of seasoned performers, parents, judges, and music lovers, had been drawn into the smallest of figures, the tiniest hands, and the largest of hearts. And at that moment, everyone knew that this was just the beginning of a performance that would be remembered for a long time. The first notes had already captured the room. But the child was only just beginning. Fingers danced lightly over the piano keys, delicate yet precise, as if each one had been chosen with thought and care. The melody of Amélie Poulain grew richer, more layered, more alive. Every person in the hall could feel the music weaving through the air, settling gently into the chest, into the mind, into the heart. The child's small hands moved faster at times, slower at others, matching the ebb and flow of the tune as though it were breathing alongside the player. Even the faintest pause carried weight, giving the audience a chance to inhale, to understand. To feel the story the music was telling, the audience leaned in. Eyes followed the movements of the little hands, fingers curling and uncurling with effortless control. Each note was clear, each phrase purposeful. It was rare to see someone so young not only play the notes correctly but also shape them into something meaningful. The child's face was serene, almost meditative, yet a spark of joy flickered in the eyes when the music swelled, a hint of pride at the sound filling the hall. People began to murmur softly to each other, sharing looks of disbelief. How could such a small child produce music so full, so alive, so expressive? This was not practice on a stage. This was storytelling with a voice far beyond the age of the performer. Backstage, some older performers stopped their own warm-ups, mesmerized. They could hear the music even behind the curtain, and it had a clarity, a depth, and a playfulness that drew them in. Some exchanged whispered remarks. "Did you hear that? That's impossible for someone so young." Others shook their heads, half in admiration, half in disbelief. Even parents who had expected a sweet, short performance found themselves holding their breath, realizing that what they were witnessing was extraordinary. The child's presence at the piano had grown quietly powerful. No one needed to clap yet. No one needed to cheer, because the music itself demanded attention. Every note seemed to carry a feeling, a memory, a story. The melody moved lightly, almost as if skipping through a sunlit park, then dipped into quiet introspection, drawing listeners in, making them pause, making them imagine. People who had come expecting a normal performance found themselves leaning forward, completely caught by the unexpected depth. Some eyes glistened with emotion, not because of grand gestures or showy technique, but because the music was honest, intimate, and touching. The little performer was telling a story that went far beyond the keys, and everyone in the hall was listening as though they had been invited into a secret. The judges, stern and experienced, watched carefully, trying not to betray surprise, yet unable to hide it entirely. One leaned forward, resting an elbow on the table, his eyes narrowing with curiosity and admiration. Another tapped a pen lightly, lost in thought. caught between professional assessment and pure wonder. They had seen countless performances, but there was something different about this one. It wasn't only technical skill, it was emotion, timing, awareness, expression. Every motion of the child's hands seemed intentional. Every phrase of music felt shaped, molded, and alive. The child was not merely playing notes, the child was telling a story. The story was already reaching hearts. In the middle of the piece, the music shifted slightly. A playful theme entered, bouncing lightly between the fingers. It was full of mischief and charm, as if the little musician were sharing a private joke with the audience. People smiled involuntarily, feeling themselves drawn into the game, laughing quietly inside as the melody skipped and twirled. It was a moment of pure connection. The audience was no longer just observing, they were participating in a silent dialogue, feeling the joy, the tension, the humor that the music carried. Even the oldest members of the crowd, who had expected a simple performance, found themselves transported, smiling, leaning closer, and sometimes closing their eyes to savor each moment. The child's small figure seemed to disappear into the music. Hands, face, and body all moved as one, perfectly attuned to the piano. There was no doubt about where the child was looking or what the child was feeling. The music revealed it all. The audience could tell when the child was joyful, when a note carried wonder, when a phrase hinted at something mysterious or thoughtful. People began to forget they were in a competition hall, forgetting the lights, the cameras, the judges. They only remembered the music, the small human shaping it, and the way it reached them. This was not performance for applause. This was performance for truth. And truth has a way of finding hearts no matter the age of the messenger. The music flowed seamlessly from playful to tender. The child's fingers flew over the keys when the melody demanded excitement, then softened to almost a whisper when emotion required subtlety. Audience members could not help but follow the rhythm, their eyes widening at the precision, their hearts swelling at the sensitivity. Every corner of the room felt the presence of the tiny musician. Even the quietest whispers backstage had stopped. Everyone held still, listening, letting the story unfold without interruption. The child had not only captured attention but had reshaped it, making every listener an active participant in the performance without saying a single word. At one point, a soft, reflective passage seemed to pause in time. The child's small hands hovered briefly above the keys, then pressed down gently, almost as if coaxing a secret out of the instrument. The audience leaned forward, some closing their eyes, letting the music wash over them like a warm wave. People felt memories, emotions, and stories rising in themselves, unbidden. Some smiled sadly, thinking of moments they had forgotten. Others felt joy bloom in unexpected places. The performance was more than music, it was a mirror, reflecting hearts back to themselves. And it all came from a tiny human whose age made the depth even more remarkable. The child never looked at the audience for long, but brief glances were enough to connect. Each glance carried curiosity, focus, and gentle awareness. The audience felt it as if the child knew they were there, felt them listening, and welcomed them into the music. It was subtle, but powerful. Adults who had seen years of training and talent could not believe what they were experiencing. The precision of the hands, the clarity of the notes, and the emotional depth all exceeded expectations. The little performer was rewriting what people thought was possible at such a young age. It's not by words or gestures, but by music itself. As the piece progressed, the child's confidence grew. Fingers moved faster, lighter, and yet more deliberate. The melody twisted and turned, dipping into melancholy before rising again in exuberance. Each transition was seamless, fluid, natural. The audience began to sense the story beneath the music, a journey that had meaning and purpose. They could feel the child's interpretation, the personal touch, and the care with which every note was placed. It was extraordinary because it seemed effortless. Yet behind that effortlessness lay countless hours of practice, dedication, and love for the music. Every small hand movement was a testament to discipline, yet expressed with the innocence of a child who only wanted to share something beautiful. Some audience members held their hands together, almost in prayer, as if the music demanded reverence. Others wiped small tears from their eyes, moved by the combination of skill and heart. There was laughter too, soft and unbidden, when the music brought moments of whimsy, proving the child could balance technical mastery with emotion and charm. No one could predict the next note, yet every note was perfectly placed. The unpredictability kept listeners leaning forward, engaged, attentive, and connected. It was impossible to look away, impossible to think of anything else. The child had captured the room completely, not by showmanship, but by sincerity, passion, mastery. Backstage, the parent watched, silently holding back tears, feeling pride swell beyond measure. Other parents whispered to one another, astounded by the small competitor. The older performers, who had walked on stage with confidence, felt a pang of anxiety and admiration. They realized that this child, so young, had done what many adults could only hope to do: touch hearts, command attention, and tell a story without a single word. It was a moment of transformation. The child was no longer simply a participant in the semifinal. The child had become the heartbeat of the event, quietly. Effortlessly, powerfully, time seemed to slow as the music moved toward the next phase. The audience could sense the climax building, the subtle rise in energy that the child controlled perfectly. Every subtle shift in volume, every gentle pause, every quick flourish was intentional, carefully guided, and emotionally potent. People began to sit straighter, breathe deeper, feeling as though the music itself held them in place, guiding them on an unexpected journey. Even those who had come expecting nothing more than a typical semifinal were now fully invested, watching and listening with anticipation, wondering what would come next, eager to experience the full depth of this small performer's gift. And through it all, the child played with calm determination. There was no rush, no hesitation, only focus and joy. The hands moved with confidence, the mind perfectly attuned to the story being told. Every note mattered, every pause mattered, every gesture mattered. The audience could feel the care, the thought, and the feeling that went into each movement. They felt the child's love for the music, the connection to the story, and the honesty of the performance. It was more than skill, it was soul, wrapped in tiny fingers, alive in a small human heart. The melody continued, building layer upon layer, mixing playfulness with reflection, curiosity with insight, strength with delicacy. The audience, now completely immersed, could no longer separate the music from the performer. The two were one. And in that union, everyone listening felt something rare: wonder, and a quiet, growing realization that they were witnessing more than a performance. They were witnessing a small human creating magic, touching lives, capturing hearts in a way that words could never describe. The music had begun to grow, weaving through the hall with a richness that made everyone pause in awe. The child's fingers moved with a precision and grace that seemed impossible for someone so small. Each note carried weight, each pause carried meaning, and every subtle change in rhythm or tone seemed to tell a story that went far beyond the sheet music. People in the audience sat completely still, almost afraid to breathe too loudly and disturb the delicate spell being cast. Some leaned forward in their seats, others closed their eyes, letting the sound reach deep inside, stirring memories, emotions, and dreams they had not thought about in years. The melody became softer, gentler, almost like a whisper meant for those paying attention. The child's small hands glided across the keys, creating waves of sound that seemed to float and shimmer in the air. There was a quiet confidence in the performance now, a sense that every motion, every note had a purpose. The audience felt it too, a subtle pull at their hearts that grew stronger with each passing moment. It was no longer just a performance. It was an experience, a shared journey, and a story being told without words. Some of the older performers, backstage, stopped mid-preparation, caught completely by the sound coming from the piano. Their own practice suddenly felt mechanical in comparison, lacking the emotion that the little performer poured into each note. Parents who had come to support their children were drawn in as well, feeling a mix of pride, awe, and disbelief. How could someone so young, barely 6, play with such understanding of the music? There was joy in the performance, but also subtle sadness, curiosity, and hope. all carefully balanced in a way that could only come from a deep connection with the art itself. The audience became even more captivated as the music shifted. A gentle, reflective passage entered, carrying a hint of longing. The child's fingers lingered over certain keys, allowing the sound to breathe and ripple through the room. Some audience members wiped their eyes, touched by the tenderness in the playing. The judges leaned forward, their pens paused, their expressions unreadable but intense. Even without clapping or words, the audience reacted to the emotion, and it grew into a quiet, collective recognition of talent and heart. Every movement of the child seemed intentional. Not a single hand motion or glance was wasted. The music itself seemed to guide the performer, and in turn, the performer guided the music, shaping it like a living, breathing story. Some moments were playful, almost mischievous, with notes skipping lightly across the piano as if teasing the listeners. Others were serious and somber, with long, gentle chords that hung in the air like soft clouds. The audience could feel every change, every subtle shift in mood, and with it, their own emotions rose and fell in response. There was a quiet strength in the child's performance that was impossible to ignore. Even in moments of technical difficulty, every note was deliberate, every movement deliberate, yet it never felt forced or unnatural. The music flowed effortlessly, and the child's presence at the piano became commanding, though not in a loud or showy way. It was the kind of presence that filled a room silently, without demand, without attention-seeking, yet impossible to ignore. People who had been skeptical before were now fully immersed, completely taken by the skill and emotion being displayed. The reflective sections gave way to more lively passages, and the contrast made the performance even more gripping. The child's small body seemed to move with the music, rocking gently with the rhythm, leaning in for emphasis, and floating back when softness was required. The audience felt the rhythm in their own chests, unconsciously swaying, tapping toes, or holding their breath as the story unfolded. There was no doubt that the performer understood the music on a level far beyond mere technical ability. Note carried intention, and the audience felt it with an immediacy that was almost overwhelming. Backstage, the parent watched silently, pride and disbelief warring on their face. They had seen years of practice, countless hours of repetition, and now it was all coming to life in front of hundreds of people. Other parents whispered softly to each other, unable to hide their admiration. The older performers, who had come expecting competition, were caught off guard. They could not compete with the authenticity, the raw connection to the music that the little child was expressing. It was humbling, inspiring, and a little intimidating. The music continued to shift, flowing seamlessly between emotions, from playful to tender, from joyful to contemplative. Every nuance was captured, every phrase carefully molded. The child's small hands danced and hovered, moved quickly and paused gently, all in perfect harmony with the melody. The audience could sense the story beneath the music, though it was subtle, personal, and unique to each listener. Some felt nostalgia, some felt hope, some felt happiness and sorrow simultaneously. The music was not just being played, it was being lived, and everyone present could feel the life in it. Even the judges could not help but be moved. They had heard countless performances, yet something about this child's interpretation went beyond technical skill. It was an emotional performance, thoughtful and expressive, yet natural and unpretentious. The kind of performance that stayed with you long after the notes had faded. The child's attention to detail, to rhythm, to dynamics, and most importantly, to feeling, was remarkable. Every gesture was meaningful, every expression intentional. Every note a part of a story that only the child could tell in that way. The music grew even more intricate, with layers of melody intertwining like threads in a tapestry. The child's small hands navigated complex passages with ease, yet never hurried, never forced. There was a fluidity that made the difficult look effortless, and the effortless look like magic. The audience gasped quietly in moments of technical brilliance, but the applause was still withheld because the spell was too strong. Everyone wanted to savor the moment fully, to experience the unfolding story without interruption. The hall was completely absorbed, hanging on every note, every pause, every breath. In one particularly delicate section, the child's hands hovered over the keys, letting a silence speak louder than any note could. The audience felt it immediately. The silence was filled with anticipation, with emotion, with connection. It was a moment that seemed suspended in time, where nothing else existed except the performer, the piano, and the people listening. The judges' pens were still. The parents held their breath. The older performers stared in awe. Even the most skeptical members of the audience felt it. Something extraordinary was happening. Something beyond skill, beyond age, beyond expectation. The reflective passage slowly gave way to another lively section, with the music bouncing and skipping, full of energy and delight. The child's small body seemed to lift and fall with the rhythm, smiling faintly at the keys as if sharing a private joke with the audience. People in the hall laughed softly, touched by the charm, drawn into the performance in a way they could not resist. The performance had become a conversation, unspoken but vivid, between the child and everyone listening. Each note was a word, each phrase a sentence, and the audience felt part of the dialogue, part of the story being told. The transition between sections was flawless, almost imperceptible, yet it carried the weight of skill, understanding, and expression. The audience could feel the flow, the rise and fall of emotion, the careful shaping of each phrase. It was not just music. It was storytelling through sound, and the storyteller was someone so young that it defied belief. Backstage, some older performers shook their heads, still unable to comprehend how a child could play with such depth, such awareness, such confidence. To each other, sharing looks of disbelief and admiration. The hall was silent, except for the music, yet that silence was alive. Buzzing with connection and wonder, the child's hands moved with astonishing speed at times. Yet every note was perfectly controlled, every gesture precise. Other performers had never seen anything like it. Fingers so small playing with such command, producing a sound so full, so expressive, and so captivating. The audience responded not with noise, but with attention, leaning forward, letting the music wash over them, taking in every nuance. Some closed their eyes to concentrate, some smiled faintly, and some held their breath, unwilling to break the spell. The performance was intimate and grand at the same time, personal and universal, delicate and powerful. A sense of awe settled over the hall. People forgot the competition, forgot the cameras, forgot the judges. All that existed was the child and the piano and the music that connected everyone. Even the most experienced performers, who had once been confident, now felt a quiet humility in the presence of such talent. There was no bravado, no need for showiness. The child's playing spoke for itself, and it spoke clearly, honestly, and with heart. Every listener felt it, each in their own way. Yet all shared the same sense. Something rare and extraordinary was happening. The child's performance seemed to grow naturally, reaching a depth that made the audience shiver. The music carried tenderness, curiosity, excitement, and thoughtfulness in perfect balance. Every subtle movement of the hands added dimension. Every glance, every pause contributed to the story. People in the hall could feel the energy of the performance, the connection, the life that came through the piano. It was not just a recital. It was a journey, and the child was leading everyone with skill, grace, and heart. Backstage, the parent watched silently, tears threatening to spill, overwhelmed by pride and awe. The older performers whispered to each other, caught between admiration and disbelief. The audience was captivated, leaning forward, holding their breath, completely absorbed in the unfolding story. The child played with focus and joy, completely unaware of the stir being caused. Each note, each phrase, each subtle inflection was perfect, and the effect was profound. It was as if the music had found a vessel small in size, but immense in heart. It was able to touch everyone in the room in a way that no one expected. And so the performance continued, flowing, growing, captivating. Each note, each pause, each movement carried meaning, connected hearts, and told a story. The audience felt it deeply, the judges felt it, the parents felt it, and even the other performers felt it. It was impossible to look away, impossible to forget, impossible not to feel moved. The small child at the piano had achieved what many adults could only dream of: a pure, honest connection through music, one that left everyone changed, inspired, and breathless. The hall was completely silent now. The kind of silence that is full of anticipation and awe. Every person present seemed to be holding their breath, leaning forward, eyes fixed on the small figure at the piano. The child's hands moved with fluidity and precision, yet there was a warmth to the playing that drew people in, made them feel as if they were part of the music. The melody, familiar yet transformed by the tiny performer, filled the room with light, joy, and gentle wonder. Each note seemed to float, carrying emotion directly into the hearts of the listeners. The music began to climb. Slowly at first, each phrase building on the last. The child's fingers flew across the keys with growing confidence, a combination of technical skill and emotional expression that was almost impossible to describe. The audience could feel it in their own chests, a rising excitement that mirrored the energy of the music. It was clear that the child was approaching the climax of the piece, the part where all the careful preparation and practice would come together in a breathtaking moment of artistry. Parents watched with wide eyes, some gripping the edge of their chairs, others leaning forward, caught up in pride and amazement. Backstage, older performers could barely look away, frozen by a combination of admiration and disbelief. Even the judges, usually stoic and reserved, seemed to be holding back reactions of pure astonishment. They were witnessing something extraordinary. The small child at the piano had transformed the room into a space where age no longer mattered, where talent, heart, and presence commanded attention fully and completely. The melody reached a point of quiet intensity. The child's hands hovered briefly, letting a note linger, then pressed down again, letting the music flow with delicate power. Every subtle shift, every gentle emphasis, every tiny pause added weight and meaning. The audience could sense the story within the story, the journey hidden in the melody. It was as if the child was speaking without words, telling secrets and emotions to each listener individually, yet also inviting everyone to share the experience together. People leaned in instinctively, some closing their eyes to listen more deeply, others watching in awe as the fingers danced across the piano. The child's face remained calm, almost serene, yet there was a spark of joy, a small smile at the corners of the lips when a difficult passage was navigated perfectly. Every motion was controlled, yet full of feeling, every note deliberate yet alive. The audience felt it, and the connection grew stronger, deeper. Hearts beat a little faster, breaths were held a little longer, eyes widened in silent wonder. The music had become a living thing, guided by a child so small that it made the effect even more astonishing as the performance approached its crescendo. The melody took on a richer, more vibrant tone. The playful sections returned briefly, mingling with moments of quiet reflection, creating a tapestry of sound that was intricate and beautiful. The child's hands moved quickly yet smoothly, fingers striking notes with strength, clarity, and elegance. Each note was precise, yet the performance never lost its warmth or charm. People in the audience felt as though they were riding the waves of the music, carried along by something they could see, hear, and feel all at once. Even the judges, who had seen countless young performers, seemed momentarily disarmed. They whispered to each other, exchanging glances of awe and admiration, yet neither dared to interrupt the spell. The music had taken over completely. Audience members who had expected a typical performance now felt a quiet thrill, a sense that they were witnessing history in the making. They were experiencing something rare, the unfiltered power of talent and heart converging in a performer too, young to carry the weight of expectation, yet doing so effortlessly. The climax of the piece arrived slowly but surely, each phrase more daring, more expressive than the last. The child's small body seemed to move in harmony with the music, leaning forward for emphasis, pulling back for softness, hands flying and pausing, shaping every note into a living, breathing story. The audience could feel every beat, every rest, every surge of emotion. The music seemed to fill the room entirely, wrapping the listeners in warmth, joy, excitement, and quiet reflection. People in the hall were no longer just spectators. They were participants, living the story with the performer, carried along by the strength and beauty of the music backstage. Some older performers whispered, unable to hide their amazement. They had expected a charming but simple performance, and instead, they were witnessing a masterful blend of technical skill and heartfelt expression that was beyond their comprehension. Parents of other performers exchanged wide-eyed glances, trying to grasp what they were seeing. It was clear that this was no ordinary recital. This was a moment that would stay with everyone present for a long time. The child's fingers moved with confidence now, striking chords with certainty and grace. Each phrase built upon the last, creating a sense of rising excitement that made the audience lean forward, holding their breath as the tension and beauty of the music grew. The performance was reaching a point where skill, emotion, and artistry converged perfectly. Everyone could sense it. Even the most skeptical viewers could not deny the effect of the music. It was alive, it was real, and it was utterly captivating. Suddenly, there was a section of quiet, tender reflection. The child's small hands hovered over the keys, letting the notes breathe and resonate. The audience could hear the emotion in each note, could feel the care and attention put into every movement. Some people closed their eyes, letting the sound take them somewhere familiar yet distant, somewhere personal yet shared with everyone in the hall. There was a softness to this part of the performance, a gentleness that contrasted beautifully with the energetic sections. The child's interpretation was nuanced, expressive, and full of heart. Then, without warning, the playful, lively section returned. The melody bounced lightly, full of energy, charm, and life. The child's small hands moved quickly, but every note was precise, every phrase clear and deliberate. The audience could feel the joy, the excitement, and the delight that the child was expressing through the piano. Laughter and smiles rippled quietly through the hall, not as noise, but as shared appreciation. The music was connecting everyone, weaving a spell that drew them into the child's world. The audience began to sense that the end was approaching. The final phrases were near, but the child showed no sign of rushing. Each note was measured, each pause intentional. The story Bung told through the piano was complete.